Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Just Us, our podcast on racial reconciliation and justice from a Christian perspective. Our scripture motto is 2 Corinthians 7, verse 2, which says, "Make room for us in your hearts." And we hope you open up your hearts today as we will be discussing the history and diversity of the Pacific Northwest and how that history shaped the societal issues we're dealing with today. Pastor John Brunt will have the privilege of introducing our speaker. And as we go, please make sure that you listen to our podcast on these platforms: Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify. You can also watch on YouTube and subscribe, please. Also share your thoughts and comments on our podcast episodes and give us a 5-star rating. We hope you enjoy this episode. We look forward to this discussion. Pastor John?
Our guest today is Dr. Terry Dopp Amott. She is a professor of history and also of English at Walla Walla University. She has a bachelor's degree from Columbia Union College, now Washington Adventist University, a master's degree from the College of William and Mary, and a doctorate in American and New England Studies from Boston University. She is the author of a work called Bold Venture, which is a history of Walla Walla University's first 100 years. She is also one of the editors, a co-editor of a work of scholarly essays on Ellen White. It's published by Oxford University, called Ellen Harmon White, American Prophet. Dr. Amott is one of those rare professors who is superb at both classroom teaching and scholarly research. That has been demonstrated in awards that she has received over the years. She's received the Burlington Award for Teaching Excellence at Walla Walla, the Presidential Award for Excellence in Scholarship, the Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching. But let me tell you what's most important about Terry. I had the privilege of being a colleague with her for over 2 decades. And Terry is just a wonderful friend and also a spiritual leader on campus. I will never forget about 20 years ago when I went through a rather difficult experience in life. And I remember how Terry reached out as a friend, as a colleague, with encouragement, and was just so helpful. She really is a friend, so it is my privilege to introduce teacher, scholar, author, and friend, Terry.
Thank you, Dr. Brunt. I would just like to spend a few minutes thinking with all of you about the history of racism in the Northwest and how it has affected at least a certain portion of the Adventist Church, the part that I was most familiar with at Walla Walla University. And to set the stage, I would like to take us back to 1925. And that is a time when James Weldon Johnson, who was the national secretary for the NAACP, came to Denver, Colorado, and gave a speech. And during that speech, he said, "Your West is giving the Negro a better deal than any other section of the country. I cannot attempt to analyze reasons for this, but the fact remains that there is more opportunity for my race and less prejudice against it in this section of the country than anywhere else in the United States." Now, if Johnson had continued straight on to the West Coast, he might not have encountered too many surprises. But it was clear that he had not yet visited the Pacific Northwest, which quietly existed as one of the most racist, highly segregated parts of the country. And because Johnson died in 1938, he would not have lived to see the edifice of institutionalized Northwest racism begin to crumble in the 1950s. how could the Northwest be so racist? This comes as a surprise to many people. What racial problems did it have to complain about? Wasn't it, primarily settled by sturdy pioneers from the northern tier of states who just kind of moved westward? And there were scarcely any racial minorities in the Northwest for those early settlers to be prejudiced against, were there? And, that is actually by design. The Pacific Northwest was claimed by the United States, and the whole bunch of it was named the Oregon Territory. It had ambiguous boundaries that were finally settled with Britain just short of war in 1846. At the outset, the Oregon Territory had established a whites-only policy, and its provisional government had adopted a black exclusion law in 1844, even before the actual boundaries were settled. And they mandated that any black person who dared to set foot in the territory would be subject to a lash law and would be publicly whipped 39 lashes every 6 months until they left the territory. Although this was not uniformly enforced, this law and its successors significantly discouraged black migration to the region. And if blacks somehow crept into the area, the government sought to ensure that they would not be able to own land and thus meaningfully participate in the economy. The Donation Land Act of 1850 was passed by the U.S. Congress at the promptings of settlers from Oregon. And this act enabled whites to be given up to 640 acres of land. This is before the Homestead Act. Whites got up to 640 acres of land, while Native American claims were simultaneously being extinguished. It was a very clear agenda what was going on here. Native Americans were placed out of view on remote, often arid reservations in parts of the countries where whites did not wish to live. And as a publication of the Oregon Historical Society has noted, and I keep talking about Oregon because it was the earliest state in this region and it used to be all of the Northwest. Oregon Historical Society noted, by removing most Indians to reservations and excluding all but white land ownership, the vision of a white homeland in Oregon was embedded in public policy. In subsequent generations, the profits, power, and political influence that flowed from near exclusive white land ownership were manifested in the construction of a racially stratified society in which white ascendancy was assured and non-white marginalization was profound. And that was from a 2009 article. Oregonians were certain that they did not like slavery, but it was for a variety of reasons. And like many other free soilers in the West, they were primarily driven by racism, wishing to exclude blacks from the area entirely. That's what free soil essentially meant. And so thus, when Oregon, which by now was shorn of Washington Territory, which was split off separately, Oregon entered the Union in 1859, just before the Civil War began. And its constitution, its state constitution, forbade slavery. And it also, it forbade blacks to live in the state at all. And Oregon thus became the only state in the United States that excluded blacks at statehood in 1859. So as James Weldon Johnson addressed that crowd in Denver, thinking about the opportunities for less racism in the West, well, he was not aware that Oregon boasted the largest Ku Klux Klan membership west of the Mississippi. It was estimated at somewhere between 40,000 and 200,000 members. These secret societies didn't keep good, membership records. These policies and practices that excluded blacks were wildly successful. And to this day, fewer than 2% of Oregonians are black. Now, the civil rights amendments to the U.S. Constitution were ratified promptly after the Civil War, but not in Oregon. While the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to Blacks, squeaked through the Oregon state legislature in 1866, Democrats swept into office a few weeks later and rescinded the ratification. The state finally ratified the 15th Amendment, which enabled Blacks to vote in 1959, the centennial of statehood. Oregon did not get around to re-ratifying the 14th Amendment and thus acknowledging Black citizenship until 1973. Now, I will note here that, of course, Washington did not become a state until several decades later in 1889. And so it had a different set of circumstances at that point. And that's why I'm giving you quite a bit of information about Oregon, because it kind of set a regional tone early on. And by the time Washington territory becomes a state in 1889, free soilism and all of those issues were a distant memory. But in major cities, rigid racial segregation was practiced from the beginning, no doubt with that example set by Oregon. And although the University of Washington practiced racial inclusivity early on and pressed the Seattle region to ease its segregation practices, Eastern Washington, along with Eastern Oregon and Idaho, was a very different story. Racial homogeneity in those regions appealed to disaffected ex-Confederates who were seeking a new life after the Civil War, and has attracted white supremacists ever since. And when Chinese laborers appeared in the Northwest in the late 19th century, they went through what Native Americans and Blacks had already experienced. In towns like Walla Walla and Pendleton, Chinese who left their designated neighborhoods to deliver laundry did so via underground tunnels. Downtowns were, by all appearances, white worlds. The federal government played a role in Northwest segregation as recently as World War II. When the Manhattan Project directors made plans for building the plutonium reactor at Camp Hanford, they mandated a whites-only workforce. And according to the nuclear historian Kate Brown, Hispanic and African-American workers were deemed an inherent security risk for this top secret project. And only after intense lobbying by Black leaders did the government approve a quota of 10% of African-American workers at Hanford. And I will note that workers on this project were paid far more than usual federal wartime projects, partly because it was brutal to live in the 100-degree plus summers and dust storms and no air conditioning at Hanford. But the quarters for African Americans and the recreational facilities for them were fenced off with barbed wire fencing from the rest of the community. And the painful reality of segregation also affected higher education. For decades, Washington State College in Pullman and its nearby neighbor, the University of Idaho, had no Black students. And that is where Walla Walla College, now university, stood as well in the mid-1950s. In those days, students who applied to the college were required to include a photograph with their application. If they were Black, they received a letter from the administration then advising them to attend the denomination's historically Black institution, Oakwood College in Huntsville, Alabama. And I will note that as this was going on in the 1950s, Oakwood College was still waiting to receive accreditation. And if they landed on the Walla Walla College campus without having received this information, they could expect to be met by an administrator with a train ticket to Alabama in hand. How did Adventists in the Northwest get this way? East of the Cascades, they had always been accustomed to a predominantly white constituency, and the North Pacific Union Conference office was maintained in Walla Walla until gas rationing during World War II forced it into the more railroad-friendly environs of Portland. Church members in general and church leaders in particular were accustomed to a white racial environment, and they showed little or no inclination to change. And yet the times and the regions were both changing. Both Washington State College, now university, and the University of Idaho, seeking to become athletically competitive, began admitting Black students in the 1950s. And at Walla Walla College, movement toward change began when Percy Christian became president in 1955. And Christian, for reasons of his own and informed by his historical training, sought to have his college become a school that would greet African American students with a warm welcome rather than a train ticket. At the same time, Walla Walla College was also being pressed to change its practices by a constituent in Seattle, Dr. Ernest Ching, a physician who was blowing the whistle on the college's treatment of minorities. Christian pressed his dean of students, Robert Brown, to begin recruiting African American students. And Walla Walla College's first Black graduate was Art Bushnell, who completed his studies in 1960, just as campuses all over the United States were vibrating with racial and social change. I'll pause there and see if you have questions or thoughts.
Wow.
I wonder what it
That
is
was a lot
about-
to absorb.
I wonder what was it about the area of Eastern Washington, Northeastern Washington, Idaho, that attracted people from the South. It's a totally different kind of climate and, different kind of topography. What attracted them there in the first place?
Well, I think there were farming opportunities, and sometimes people moving from the South often had been disadvantaged before and during the Civil War, and may not have had much land availability for themselves. Meanwhile, the Homestead Act, a product of the Civil War, would open up new lands in the West, and at times perhaps more productive agricultural land, because so much of the South was devoted to cotton production, which exhausted the soil fairly quickly, and without proper crop rotation, it made it hard to continue to have good land available in the South. So yes, I would say the weather certainly be quite different, but there were places in the inland Northwest, I would say, especially where plentiful land would be available in the late 19th century. And another factor that maybe didn't get stated overtly, but was certainly a factor, was because of that free soil emphasis early on, there was a predominantly white population already.
I was gonna say, well, thank you first and foremost for all the information that you have presented, because that is actually a very it hit home, because I graduated from Oakwood University, and Oakwood University has beautiful people, it's a beautiful campus, but having the notion of people being sent to Oakwood because they look like me and they wanted to attend Walla Walla is kind of mind blowing. And I asked myself the question, especially as an Adventist, we have a role to play, yet we were still entwined with what the world was doing. So I would expect that from outside the world, other colleges, right? But not in an Adventist institution, which that is, and even till this day, there's still some racial tension within our schools, and it's something that I still don't know why it's happening, if that makes sense, especially with us having to take the mantle of being this Christian and how Christ would act towards certain people, yet we have racism within our churches, within our schools. It's still something still unsettling.
Yes, and I think sometimes those things go unacknowledged, and there's been an attitude by many who may not be directly affected by racism that the Northwest simply hasn't been on the forefront of stories about racism. And so sometimes that has been more hidden, less acknowledged perhaps. And I think through all of this, we are reminded of how much people who are deeply religious are also affected by culture, sometimes in ways that go unacknowledged or maybe are not fully even grasped and realized. I will also mention that in the 1930s, the Seventh-day Adventist denomination was seeking to have a theological seminary, and they were feeling more and more that this would be very important, that all Adventist theologians be trained by the denomination. And while they were getting it up and running, they held seminary classes on the 3 West Coast colleges in the summers, so at La Sierra, PUC, and Walla Walla College. And then they prepared to have the seminary be, they were originally thinking of the campus of Washington Missionary College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. But Maryland, of course, was a slave state. It was loyal to the Union, but it was a slave state. It is part of the South. And Washington, D.C. itself is also part of the South. That was by design a long time ago. And so Washington Missionary College was segregated. It had no students of color in those years. And so they said, well, what are we going to do? We can't have the seminary students from the West Indies come to our campus because we're segregated. And that was a big, it kind of delayed the development of the seminary there. And they would eventually put the seminary, they would house it not on the campus of Washington Missionary College, now Washington Adventist University, but instead on the grounds of the General Conference buildings. And the South building at the General Conference site when it was in Washington, D.C. was the former seminary building. And so there were all these existing issues that the church had been saddled with early on.
I appreciate your history. Well, that was a good lesson. A lot of it I didn't know before about the Pacific Northwest. I graduated from Andrews University, where the theological seminary is, and I've heard a lot about the history there as far as segregating students as well, students of color. They couldn't sit in the cafeteria, and they had to wait until all the white students left before they could go in and have their meal. And it's a disturbing history, and very sad and devastating, actually. And I wanted to understand, you said, you mentioned a few times things were set up by design or happened by design. And I want to understand, if possible, how or why our church, our schools, not Oakwood University, decided to appropriate societal designs of segregation until they wanted to become part of athletics. And then, now we need the Black students. Now we need them to come in and play basketball and do all their physical, prowess, but not educationally, not spiritually. Those aspects were left out. Was that by design? So that's what I struggle with our church.
I would say that in the case of Walla Walla College, the integration of the student body and eventually the faculty was not a feature of athletics at all. I mentioned Washington State College and University of Idaho, which is why they integrated in the 1950s. And once they had done that, I think it became a little easier for Walla Walla College to take those steps. But it's also a factor of personnel. They had a new president who was more comfortable with moving in those directions. So let me say a few things too about how it came to be that Walla Walla College would integrate the faculty. And I should also say that different campuses in different parts of the country handled things differently. Pacific Union College had a multiracial student body from very early on. And they had a very well-known scholar of the Harlem Renaissance, Arna Bontemps, who was a graduate of Pacific Union College. And so in the 20s, so they had a different story and a different background. And the Northwest was quite distinct from what was going on in Northern California during those decades. Pacific Union College also was well known for its work to try to help its significant Japanese American student population during World War II that was slated to go to internment camps. And they were able, this research done by my colleague Hillary Dickerson on this topic has revealed that Pacific Union College worked hard to arrange for their Japanese American students to transfer to Union College and Emmanuel Missionary College, now Andrews, where there was less concern. There was great concern on the West Coast about Japanese American students. And so lots of different things swirling around during those decades. But Percy Christian would end up being the president of Walla Walla College, now university, who would integrate the faculty as well. And as near as we are able to tell, the first tenure track appointment to a predominantly white Adventist college in North America was at Walla Walla College in 1962. I'd like to tell you about that story. And it involves an individual named Donald Blake, who was a biologist who came to the faculty at Walla Walla College, who also would be one of the pioneers in the civil rights movement in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And Christian did not set out deliberately to integrate the faculty at this point. It was just hard enough to find loyal, qualified professors who were willing to work for denominational wages. And that was the situation when the biology department sought to fill a faculty position in early 1962. They advertised for a specialist in vertebrate physiology and entomology, and they received nearly 20 applications. Most of the applicants, though, had specialized in different fields, and the most highly qualified man for the job and its description was a PhD candidate at the University of Rhode Island, Donald Blake. He was a graduate of Oakwood College in the 1950s, and because Oakwood was not yet accredited, he had to do additional work at Michigan State University in order to go to graduate school. And Blake's specialty was veterinary and medical entomology, but his subfields included the emphasis that Walla Walla College desired. And so his qualifications put him at the top of the list. His skin color put him at the bottom. And I will mention, too, that in college applications or job applications in those days, it was standard practice for everybody to attach a photograph of themselves. And there are reasons why it's no longer legal to require that. The biology department approached all the other candidates who were less qualified professionally in that area, and everyone turned them down. They decided to limp along with the vacancy for a year so they could look some more, but then one of the remaining faculty became ill, and they had a staffing crisis on their hands. The chair of biology at that time was Harold Coffin, Dr. Harold Coffin. He was not sure what to do. So, accompanied by one of his faculty members, Don Rigby, who would later become chair of the department, he discussed the situation with Percy Christian. He mentioned this application from Donald Blake. "Do you think we can use this person?" Christian asked. "We know we're looking for staff in the department." Coffin and Rigby replied that they had discussed it. "But given that he's a Negro," Coffin replied, "would the board stand for this?" "I think it's time for us to hire a minority person, a Black person in this school," Christian responded. Describing this situation nearly 30 years later when I interviewed him in 1990, Rigby recalled it was a very, very courageous move given the history of the school. So thus, just after the Walla Walla College graduation weekend in June of 1962, Don Blake flew to Seattle, where he was met by Dr. Coffin, who wanted him to see the Marine Research Station at Anacortes, where the biology faculty were gearing up for summer teaching. Then he returned to Seattle, flew to Walla Walla to meet President Christian and Dr. Rigby. And Don Blake had a wonderful mixture of being a jovial, extroverted, gregarious person, Rigby recalled. And Christian was impressed with the man and with his academic qualifications. He immediately called the North Pacific Union Conference president and Walla Walla College board chair, Elder Cord Scriven, to set up a meeting in Portland. In those days, the college board was composed primarily of Union Conference officers, told that the other board members were already headed out of town for speaking appointments. Christian and Blake were surprised to learn that most of them had found ways to stay in town and be at the office that Friday morning. Scriven led them into a boardroom where they met with the 6 additional conference officials. And as I recreate this scene, I think it's difficult for us to understand now why this was a big deal. And I would say primarily these are people who have very little experience being around African Americans. It's just not been part of their geography in the Northwest. One of them was actively opposed to integrating the faculty, Blake recalled. He asked how my coming to Walla Walla College would be a blessing. Blake replied there were a lot of good SDAs in the Northwest that the good Lord wanted to take to heaven, but since they would need to learn to live next to me up there, they needed to get used to living to me down here. The atmosphere, he said, was not welcoming. He said everybody was in a knife fight. Everyone had a knife but me, but I've been through that before. And after all of that, he must have been surprised when he was asked at the meeting if he would consider coming to Walla Walla if asked. He replied he had promised the Lord to take the first offer he received, as he had a family to care for. So Elder Scriven then personally drove Christian and Blake to the airport, and Blake would return to Rhode Island and Christian to Walla Walla. When they entered the terminal, Scriven turned to Christian and said, I will walk with Brother Blake to the plane. You wait here for me. Scriven could not offer the position until the full board met the following Monday, but he asked Blake to refuse any other offers he might receive before Monday. When Blake received the promised call at 2 p.m. on Monday, he agreed to come. He became Walla Walla College's Jackie Robinson. Don Blake was a perfect person for the breakthrough, said Don Rigby. Blake noted that Christian support did not end with his arrival in College Place. When I got to Walla Walla, he said Christian was always supportive, as was his son, John Christian, who was a teacher in the history department. Christian was not a micromanager. He expected departments to care for their routine affairs, but he let Blake know that he had his back. Blake was an immediate hit with students and colleagues. He was well liked, said Rigby. He was a good teacher. He was several times the Santa Claus at Christmas parties, and kids would have him come to their weddings, be the MC of the programs, all kinds of things. I'm quoting Rigby. In spite of those strong relationships, pioneering integration in southeastern Washington was not easy. And in Northwest Adventism was no easier for Don Blake than breaking the color line had been in baseball for Jackie Robinson. One summer, Rigby and Blake headed for a student's wedding in Canada, where Blake was slated to serve as the MC for the wedding dinner. While still in Washington, they stopped for lunch. As we drove into the parking lot near the door, Rigby recalled, you could see a little sign that said open. We were in the car, and both Don and his wife got out of the car. As the Rigbys began to exit the back seats, the Blakes proceeded ahead of them. All of a sudden, they turned around. What's wrong? Rigby said. We're not going into that restaurant. Why not? Look at the sign. As the Blakes had approached the restaurant, the proprietors switched their sign to closed. It was noon. If we had time, Blake went on, we could drive away and come back and you'd see it open all of a sudden again. We've experienced that many times. And the saddest experience, according to Rigby, was when the Blakes tried to purchase a home in College Place. Blake's future neighbors, most of whom were Adventists and were even colleagues on the campus, did not want this to happen. They began to circulate a petition to keep the Blakes out of the neighborhood. They made the mistake of knocking on the door of Pete Wolfswinkel, who was the head of the college motor pool. They not only didn't get his signature, Rigby remembered, but they got a lecture within just a fraction of their lives. Wolfswinkel told them, if you continue this, I'll do everything in my power to make it very difficult for you to carry through with that petition. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. The petition disappeared, the Blakes moved in, and the sun came up the next morning. Another Black family who happened to be Catholic tried to purchase a new home in another part of College Place a short time later, offering a large cash down payment for a home that had languished on the market for 6 months. The husband and father of this family was a pharmacist at the VA hospital adjacent to College Place. And according to Blake, the contractor who was selling the house appealed to a Walla Walla College administrator to block the sale, and the man agreed to help. When Blake later confronted the administrator, he said it was just business. He had significant investments in the neighborhood. In contrast, the Christian family made it possible for this family to live in College Place and rented a house to them. And so after Percy Christian departed in 1964 to become president of Pacific Union College, Blake continued to participate in community life. On March 9, 1965, a Unitarian minister, James Reeb, who had marched that day for voting rights at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, was attacked by an angry mob of white men and severely beaten. He died in the hospital 2 days later. The community of Walla Walla, in particular the students and faculty of Whitman College, were very responsive to these events, and they announced a protest march from the Whitman campus to the steps of the Walla Walla County Courthouse. The two persons were invited to speak, one from Whitman College and Donald Blake from Walla Walla College. He decided he better check this out with his department chair first. He went and talked to Don Rigby about it. And I have to say that this kind of involvement in civil rights activity in those days in the Northwest or anywhere else pretty much in the United States was unheard of among the Adventist church. And Blake said, I wanted to participate in civil rights activities downtown. What would happen if I marched? I'll support you, Rigby said. I believe in it. I might not march myself, although I might, but I'll sure support you. And I'll support you until they kick me out of here in terms of your right to do that. I believe you should if you feel you should, and you certainly have a right to do it. Only two Walla Walla College faculty marched that day, Don Blake and history professor John Christian. Rigby reported that another faculty member who had been opposed to Blake joining the faculty roared into his office. I can still see him with fire breathing out of his eyes, literally beating his hand on my desk and saying to me, you've got to be responsible. You've got to stop this. You're the only one who's responsible to this point, and you're allowing it. Surely you must know about it. I know about it, Rigby replied. You've got to stop it. You cannot let this go on, the other professor roared. I'm not only not going to stop it, I support him in doing it, Rigby answered. I believe he has every right to do it. It's a just cause. He's not hurting anyone. And Rigby would muse later, I've often wondered to this day whether he ever forgave me because he never seemed to forget it. The Walla Walla newspaper and the Whitman newspaper reported the event, although the Walla Walla College newspaper was mum. Dr. George Ball, a religion and ethics professor at Whitman, and Dr. Donald Blake of the Walla Walla College biology department were the speakers. And according to the Whitman newspaper, Blake reminded the listeners that concern for civil rights was not an end in itself, but required a commitment of action. Blake reminded the audience that discrimination is not a unique Southern characteristic and that its subtle forms exist in Walla Walla as well as throughout the South and throughout the North. And Blake led the audience in singing We Shall Overcome as 400 people joined hands. Some College Place neighbors turned their rage into action once the news hit the papers. When I got home from the march, the phones were ringing off the hook, recalled Blake. And he said I had to change my phone number, had to get an unlisted number. Bricks were thrown at my window. The Blake's son walked to kindergarten school at Davis Elementary every day, and he was repeatedly harassed. Blake reported that he had the College Place police escort his son to and from school for months afterward. Why were Adventists in College Place so afraid of change? Why were they so angry? Not all of them, but some of them. They were so accustomed to the way things had been And the way they had always been, they were so afraid of what might happen if anything changed. And issues differ, but dealing with the new, the unexpected is still painful. The reality makes it all the more significant that in 1962, a college president, Percy Christian, in 1965, a department chair, Don Rigby, were ready to support change. So that is just, I hope, an instructive lesson from history. 1962 was a long time ago, almost as long ago as 1846 or 1850. But let me tell you about something that happened more recently. In the 1990s, the Student Administration Vice President Lisa Bissell-Paulson and I took a group of women student leaders to the national meeting of the Association of Adventist Women in Seattle. We were eager for them to meet some of the women who had brought change to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Madeline Haldeman, the brilliant and rigorous teacher of Greek to generations of church leaders at La Sierra University, was there. Josephine Benton and John Daffern, some of the first Adventist women pastors in North America, were there. Mary Kay was there. Lisa and I were sure that our collegiate editor, our student association executive vice president, and others would be inspired and impressed by the women they met. One of our student leaders was the student body social vice president, an African-American woman named Alta. Like the others, she came to the conference meetings on Friday. I happened to notice she was wearing a very striking professional-looking pantsuit. Near the end of the day on Friday, I noticed her family picking her up at the convention hotel, which was understandable because they lived in the area. But we did not see Alta again until it was time to return home on Sunday. I wondered why she had decided to skip out on the rest of the meetings we had invested in. I did not know why she had left until the next collegian appeared. The editor had asked each student attendee to describe how they had experienced this conference. They provided glowing accounts of the interesting, inspiring sessions they had attended and the dynamic women leaders they had met. Alta described how much solidarity she felt with these women during the Friday morning sessions. During a break, she visited the restroom, and on the way out, she met one of the conference attendees who, like Alta, was wearing the badge that all the attendees wore. Alta, looking spiffy in her dressy pantsuit and glowing with a sense of unity and camaraderie she had experienced, gave the woman a big smile and reached out to shake her hand. The woman smiled back, handed Alta her used paper towel, and said, "You keep such a nice place here." That was the extent of Alta's involvement with the Association of Adventist Women Conference in Seattle. Why did this conference attendee, dedicated to promoting tolerance, see only one thing when she looked at Alta? Why did she think domestic help was the only possibility for someone like her? Where do these attitudes come from? Mid-1990s were a long time ago, weren't they? But I wish I had $1 for every time since then I've heard a confident white person proclaim we no longer need to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day or plan special events for Black students during Black History Month or celebrate Black history at all because racial prejudice doesn't exist anymore. At least these white voices have not experienced racial prejudice, therefore it must not exist. And yet, I have to say that those attitudes get harder and harder over this past year with the racial reckoning we've had in this country. And even though it's harder and harder for some people to admit that there are still things that need to change, I think as a teacher, I see this as a teaching opportunity right now, and I don't want it to go unnoticed. Thoughts?
Yes. I was gonna ask you, especially as a teacher and in Walla Walla, when you see or hear these ignorant things, how do you go about it? I don't know if you ever seen a student experiencing racism. How are you an ally to those kind of students, and how do you hold your people or white people accountable to the things that they say? Or I'll leave it as that.
I think that I think the best way to create change in attitudes is to help understand context and to kind of lay bare some of these things that don't get talked about. And as an American history teacher, I have opportunity to do that all the time. I will say that because of what has happened in this last year, I added a new class to my offerings for this year. I have for many years, over 20 years, taught a class called the African American Experience, and it's an upper division class. But I added a lower division one because I felt that we needed opportunities for students to think about this in more detail. And so, and as I tell them, I said, if you're going to talk about the Black experience in America, which affects everyone regardless of skin color, you are also talking about the white experience in America. And Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winning novelist, said in the early 90s that it's very important to study white attitudes, not just to look at the stories and experiences of Black Americans who have been disprivileged and abused in various ways, but to try to get at and to examine how white people got this way. And she has this incredible passage in Beloved, where the novel, where she talks about the kindest white people in the whole story were an abolitionist brother and sister, quite elderly, who made a house available to some escaped slaves to live in, and did many kind things for them. And yet she slips in this little scene late in the book where they have on their kitchen counter a little bank, collecting coins bank, that is essentially a little blackface bank. And so these very racially tolerant people still had this blind spot. And I think that is a kind of a small little message in the overall book, but I think Toni Morrison keeps wanting to remind us that we have to look at and delve into these difficult situations. I have a student of color in my class at present who told me that he went to a predominantly Black high school in the East Coast, and he said they never taught me these things. And so he's welcoming the opportunity to go into more depth and to find out where these come from. And we have had teaching moment after teaching moment, even in these last few weeks, to talk about wealth and disparities and health disparities and so forth. And if we don't take advantage of that teaching moment and explore those topics, some of them difficult, we're not doing our job.
Now the story of Elta was just painful, her experience. And I felt that. Yeah, I felt that. And it's sad to know that the Bible, the Word of God, that tells us how to treat people the way Jesus treated them, was not enough for our schools. And you said people were afraid of the change. They didn't know how to deal with the changes, even though we had a roadmap of how to deal with people. It just breaks my heart. And I do want to say my son is considering Walla Walla. He's graduating in June, and he's considering Walla Walla as one of his schools of choice. And if he decides to go to Walla Walla, he went there just this past weekend for the preview. Yeah, and he met a professor in the history department, a gentleman, I don't remember his name. But he was very excited about, yes. And he came home excited about the opportunity to be there and to check out the school. And this is his decision. This is going to be his 18-year-old grown-up decision to choose the university he wants to attend. If he decides to go to Walla Walla, what will he see there as far as progress from where Elta was, for example, what she dealt with till now? What is set up there for students, minority students, and just all students to see that, hey, we love you, we embrace you, we're not putting you in boxes or silos to be on your own, what will that experience be like, if he decides to go there?
Well, I think he would be warmly welcomed. I know that if he chooses to study history, he would find a very receptive and nurturing environment there. And what you have whenever you get a group of people together on a campus, you get people from many different kinds of backgrounds. And I think that a good deal of what we see in the Northwest is where we see attitudes that we wish were more progressive than they are. Much of that comes from simply not having firsthand experience with people of color.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new thing, and it is a very important part of a mission for any institution to be able to bring people to better understanding. This last week, we carried on a teach-in conference that included addresses by white and Black scholars and white and Black faculty addressing the question, what does equity look like? Because there are so many misunderstandings about these issues, and we felt that we really wanted to look at it in depth, especially given everything that has happened in recent months. And also because we have a wonderful and vibrant faculty and staff group of people of color, but who are also, they don't want to be put in the position of having to explain racism to white people. That gets really old. And so it is clear, and I think it's understood in our faculty that it's everybody's role to address these issues. And we had over 1,300 different attendees at these various events that we did involving 21 different classes and some public lectures. And that's, I think, how you create change. And if you just do an occasional event here or an occasional one there, then people forget. You have to keep doing the hard work. That's how change happens.
Well, thank you for that. So we have a few more minutes here. This has been fulfilling, educational, and thought-provoking. And before we say goodbye for now, I want to know, Pastor John, do you have any last thoughts or questions before Dr. Amott gives us a final word?
Well, I want to thank Terry for being able to present the history so clearly and in such an interesting way and such a challenging way. Mm-hmm. And what you just said about people of color being asked to explain racism to whites, I'm finding that in the church, that is just such a problem. Yeah. And it is something that we all have to do. And Terry, I really appreciate your willingness for many years now to challenge us in these areas. It's been very helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we're all very busy, but there are things that can't wait, things we can't just put off and, well, we'll deal with that later, right?
Yep.
And we can all read. We're capable of doing that. And there are long lists of excellent resources. You can't read them all necessarily, but and I'd be happy to share with you a little bibliography that somebody gave me that I think is very useful. Pick one or two of those things and read those things and widen your experience a bit and think about where your friends come from and what you and your friends talk about. And is there any way that you might consider widening the circle of people you spend time with? Mm-hmm. That's not hard to do. We had a lecture this last week by Dr. David Williams, who's on the faculty of the school, the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. And he's a Seventh-day Adventist scholar, educated at Andrews and other places. But at the end of his talk, he spoke of several passages in the Bible, Isaiah 58, Matthew 25, that explain and remind us of our obligations and our responsibilities. And he wove in addition, comments by Ellen White in her book, The Southern Work, and other things that she did in her latter part of her career, directing people towards those principles of Isaiah 58 and a ministry of healing, and talking about the responsibility to work with people in large cities and work with the poor. And although she herself evolved and certainly had some experiences involving race that can be considered controversial, as she reached those latter years of her life, immersing herself in the descriptions of the life of Christ, it becomes more and more important to her to think about all of God's children being absolutely equal before God. And she makes those points emphatically. And so Dr. Williams brought out some of those things in his conversation with us last week. It's not just an option or something useful you can think about sometimes. It's an absolute requirement for us as a community of faith to absorb what Isaiah 58 and what Matthew 25 actually mean, and how that affects our lives every day.
Absolutely.
How would you see the trajectory over the 4 decades you've been in Walla Walla? Have you seen slow, steady progress? Have you seen ups and downs? What kind of a trajectory do you think it's been?
Well, I think that as at any place, reflects the culture around it to some extent. And so just as our culture has had ups and downs, I think any subset of the culture does as well. And one thing I have seen over these past few years especially is an increased understanding of the essential importance of addressing these topics in ways that I think are pretty serious and profound.
Well, Dr. Amott, thank you so much for being here. Is there something else you wanted to add? Go right ahead.
I was just going to say one more thing. My prayer for my church and its institutions is that we will find ways to be in the forefront and not trailing in the rear with these issues. And I have seen statements from local conferences and the Union Conference in this last year about the importance of equality that I think sets an excellent example. And that's something to build on.
Most definitely. And we do have to follow all the requirements that were laid out for us in Micah 6:8, right?
Exactly.
We have to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. And hopefully when we do that, or people begin to do that, we'll start to see some change. Well, we thank you so much for being here, Dr. Amott, with us. And we appreciate the knowledge that you brought. It was enlightening. And to our listeners and our viewers, we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and be blessed.